Thank you. Welcome back. Welcome back, all of you. I'm excited for our next panel.
Fantastic.
There are two wonderful guests who both in their own way have undertaken very compelling work. We'll introduce them again one at a time. It's been agreed that John Carr will go first, so I will introduce him first. John Carr is the founder and director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. He tells me he has never been to the state of Michigan, but he is from Minnesota. And I don't know if you know this, John, but half of my people are from Minnesota too.
You know what? People on the East Coast think we go to high school together.
I remember that.
Yeah.
John's work at Georgetown has been important over the last several years through the Catholic Social Thought and Public Life Initiative. And he is here today to talk about his work that he's undertaken to help the church move towards healing. And John is a survivor of clergy sexual abuse. John Carr.
Hello. Thank you, Stephen. I'm honored to be a part of this important conversation on the way forward, particularly the theme of principles for effective lay action, and to be a small part of these really impressive gatherings on healing the breach of trust. When I want to thank President Garvey for the invitation, and Stephen for reaching out. Stephen is a friend. He was a part of our polarization gathering at Georgetown a year ago. When we heard about the Catholic Project, my colleague Kim and I invited Steve to lunch over at Georgetown. And one of the things we ought to do is find ways to work together on this, and this is a great example of this. I'm really glad to be with Teresa. We've been trying to get together for months, and Steve accomplished a lot in making that happen. It's great to be back in the neighborhood. I spent more than 2 decades across the street at the Bishops' Conference. It's good to be with my friend and successor, Jonathan Reyes. We share the most pompous title in Washington. How would you like to have been or be the executive director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops? I often tell the story of being introduced. I was in an elevator with a couple, and you could see on my name card, and he said, he's in charge of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. bishops. And she looked at me and said, you need to do a better job. So I'm happy to be here for who invited me, who I'm with, and to be a part of this great effort by Catholic U. I'm not happy by what brings us together. We need to do a better job of protecting the young and the vulnerable, of ensuring accountability and transparency and responsibility, and restoring trust and renewing and reforming our institution. What I'd like to do in my time is talk very briefly about what we've done at Georgetown and a couple of the lessons from that, but then talk more personally. This can be very abstract. We have had really thoughtful, insightful theological reflection, institutional perspectives. I'm going to speak more personally than institutionally because I think it offers some lessons and maybe some directions for the future. Since I left the conference a while ago, I was invited by President DeGioia to come to Georgetown. I really admire the Catholic Project as a title. It is short, succinct, intriguing. We do not have a title which is short, succinct, or intriguing. We have the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. It is boring but descriptive. We work at the intersection between faith and public life. We do large public dialogues for the university and the public. We reach out to young people in Washington, in public life, to remind them that their faith can be an asset. We, in particular, convene young Latino leaders. And then each year we bring together leaders from across the country to focus on challenges. The last one was around polarization in the church, and frankly, the next one's going to be about lay leadership. So to be honest, we don't focus on ecclesial issues, but we found that, frankly, we couldn't get to the discussion of the way the principles of Catholic social thought and public life could impact public life without dealing with this. In fact, one of the terrible costs of the crisis, not acknowledged enough, has been the way that it has undermined and diminished the credibility of the institutional church in public life at a very moment when the unborn and the undocumented and religious freedom and racial justice need the voice of the church. But so we have done a series, I think it's 7, and I'm not going to go through those. They're not terribly different from what CUA has done. We did one especially for young leaders, and I will never forget the freshness of the anger. This was not old news for them. This was a new outrage on their part. We did one for the larger community that had 4 survivors on a panel of 5 to talk about the costs. We met in our chapel in a context of prayer and reflection to talk about what this was doing morally and spiritually. I remember one Georgetown student saying, "This makes it hard to be a young Catholic." We talked to the board of directors and the board of regents of the university. We had a session with Father Zollner after the meeting in Rome. And it was great to have Father Zollner share with us what happened, but it was more as important that we had a parish talk about what they were doing with this, and had a survivor talk about his experience as a survivor and on the review board of the Archdiocese. And I'll never forget, he said, what is your most important message? And he said, for me, it was 5 words. It is not your fault. And we just did a session with the Georgetown Law School. It had a fancy title, but my title was How the Law and Lawyers Helped Uncover the Crisis and in some ways made it worse. And as I said, we'll have a convening shortly. So that has been our institutional response. I'm going to talk, as I said, more personally. I have dealt with this for 50 years. I've had a great opportunity to serve the church, but it's personal, it's professional, it's institutional for me. It's haunted my service. And I'm going to be very candid. Whenever I take a new job, I say to my bosses, you will get my loyalty, and the price of my loyalty is my candor. And one of my bosses said, I will take less loyalty if you could give me less candor. But I think we have to be specific. So I'm going to talk in rather specific terms about my experience and suggest that it offers 10 lessons or directions. In the 80s, I had the privilege of working here in Washington with Cardinal Hickey. I was Secretary for Social Concerns. I was invited into a meeting by the Archbishop, not yet a cardinal, and a senior cleric was accused of abusing young men. And Cardinal Hickey had a canon lawyer and a civil lawyer investigate this. They said this probably happened. There were wonderful men around the table, all clerics except me, and they saw this absolutely through the eyes of this distinguished priest. This couldn't possibly have happened. This must be some terrible misunderstanding. I've known him all my life, And it came to me and I said, I don't know, Monsignor. But short of murder, this is about the worst thing I could imagine for my child. It affects faith, Eucharist, family, authority, sexuality, confidence. And I said, you have investigated this. They say this happened. I think you have to remove him. And it was 4-1, and Cardinal Hickey removed him. And the lesson there for me was there have to be more parents in the room when these decisions are made, number one. More moms and dads, now more survivors, and particularly in my experience, more women. The priest looked at this through the eyes of a brother priest, and for me, there need more parents in the room. Lesson one. I was also there when Cardinal Hickey was advised by attorneys that we could make this go away. Don't meet with victims, don't acknowledge, don't apologize. We'll handle this, and we'll handle it quietly. And I heard described treatment centers and therapists who said, we can fix this. Took some time and a lot of money and came back and said, it's okay now. Those were tragic blunders. Some of those people were lay people. A lot of those people were lay people. I am very much a supporter of lay participation in not only sex abuse, but ecclesial life in lots of ways. But the lay people who are going to be involved need to be independent and focused on the needs of the vulnerable, not the protection of the institution or the care of the perpetrators. So I want more participation, not only in this, but in larger questions of governance and finances and human resources, the criteria for the selection of bishops, where pastors go. But I have two caveats on that. One is, I think it'd be a good idea for our pastor to be evaluated. We have a wonderful pastor. Every once in a while, people ought to sit down and say, these are your strengths and weaknesses. But I want the first 5 people who volunteer to be disqualified. The polarization in our church, the sort of craziness that can happen in a local community, let's be careful who does the evaluating. Secondly, I am afraid we could replace a clerical elite with a lay elite. Many bishops I know work with, consult with lay leaders. They're mostly affluent, powerful, well-connected, highly educated white people. And I'm an affluent, well-connected, highly educated white person. I think we sometimes have good advice, but it's not all the advice. I want the Latino plumber to have a place at the table as well as the big donor. I want the parish secretary to have a voice as well as the management expert. The diversity of our church has to be reflected in the lay leadership we develop. So more lay leadership, beware of laity who defend the institution, not the vulnerable, and let's make sure the laity are reflective of the diversity of our church. That's number 2. Number 3, I served 100 yards from here over at the conference. It was a great job. I saw people stand up for human life and dignity around this country, around this world. We were able to make a difference on lots of things. It was in the middle of the scandals. I was there in 2002. I was working for Cardinal Law, who was my chairman in 2002, personally. I talked to him several times a week. I was also the parent of teenage boys, and I found that combination crushing. At one time, I poured my heart out to the Cardinal, who listened, but he said, no one talks to me the way you do. And that was not a I think the lesson is many bishops, not all by any means, are isolated, surrounded by people who reinforce their own judgments. And because of their office, because of the esteem we have for them, they are often isolated and lack a connection to the experience of ordinary families. And so that has led, in some cases, to a lack of understanding and a lack of urgency. We have to be very careful about this. I took note very much of what the Archbishop said. We have to overcome the isolation that comes with a certain kind of clericalism, but we have to do it in a way that honors and renews the priesthood as a ministry of service, as a source of faith and life, not of power and privilege. So that's number 3. Our leaders too often are isolated, surrounded by people who reinforce their own judgments, the good ones and the not so good ones. Number 4, Cardinal McCarrick has been my friend, my boss, in many ways my ally for many, many years. And I found the revelations about him just crushing. I can remember being on the sidewalk in front of theological college, and I had heard an accusation, and I looked online and I saw some of the stuff that was there, and I said to him, "What's going on here?" I said, I'd just been through the thing with Cardinal Law. I said, "How is this possible?" He looked at me right in the eye, and he said, "John, if any of that were true, I would not be here." Those charges are from my enemies, and they've been repeatedly investigated. If any of that were true, I wouldn't be here. And I admit that's what I wanted to hear. He was my friend. He was my leader. And I accepted it, frankly, because it was inconceivable to me that someone who had done those things could be appointed Archbishop of Washington and the Cardinal of the Church. So lesson number 4 for me is there have to be independent, credible, and effective ways for bishops to be reported, investigated, and held accountable for their behaviors, their abuse of power, their actions, and their non-actions. And that's true whether you admire them or not. For me, at one level, this is really complicated. We've talked about some of those complications. At another level, it's really simple. The church expects me to keep my vows. I expect our priests to keep their promises. I will do anything in the world to protect my children. I want our church to do everything it can to protect our children. And whether I work at the Bishops' Conference or at Georgetown or anywhere else, I am accountable for what I do and I don't do. And our leaders need to be accountable for what they do and don't do. That's number 4. Number 5, I had the occasion to meet with Archbishop Vigano to talk about the work of our initiative. And I said I was going to be candid. At the end of the meeting, I said, I'm from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and that's my home diocese, and I don't know all the specifics, but there needs to be a new archbishop there. That what has happened, the decisions that have been made, the investigations that have been undertaken, the church is being heard. And he looked, I said, you can cut this off, I just want to tell you. And it is the people who are most committed to the church who sadly believe that. And he looked at me and he said, we can't give in to the enemies of the church, the media and the lawyers. And I said, every day this goes on is a good day for the enemies of the church. And then, so institutional protection can blind us to protecting the vulnerable. And frankly, beware of those who would use the suffering of victims to advance their own ideological agendas or ecclesial priorities, whether they're left or right, whether they love the Pope or they don't love the Pope. I think, and this is Jonathan's point about politicizing the scandal, I think in our church we have these factions, and we have chaplains to those factions and cheerleaders for those factions, and some say it's homosexuality, there's a powerful gay network, or there's a destructive clerical closet. Some say it's Vatican II, it's either we didn't implement it enough, or we implemented it in the wrong way, or we even tried to implement it. Some say it's priestly celibacy, it should be reviewed. Others say it needs to be renewed and reemphasized. Others say it's the male priesthood, which has been undermined or is a part of the problem. We should talk about all these things. But none of these things, nothing about the sexual revolution gave priests permission to abuse the young and the vulnerable. Lesson number 6, Cardinal Wuerl is a dear friend. He has been a great supporter. I think he has done remarkable things for this university, for our archdiocese, for me. And he was better than most on this. I don't know of any other bishop who went to Rome to say you can't send back a predator. But he became a symbol of the lack of accountability. One of the things I've learned as a parent is you're only as happy as your saddest child. And one thing I've learned in this scandal, you're only as good as your worst case. And you have to own the failures, you have to apologize, and you have to find a way to ask for forgiveness instead of insisting that we did the right thing, we did the right thing. So defending past choices is no substitute for owning and personally apologizing for past actions. Somebody asked earlier, how do we tell our story? I say anytime I'm asked, the safest place in U.S. society for a young person is in the Roman Catholic Church because of the steps that have been put in place. But we can't make that case. Our bishops aren't the ones to make that case. Our priests are going to have trouble making that case. In some ways, we've lost the benefit of the doubt, and some of the rest of us do. But defending the past is no substitute for owning it, apologizing it, and listening. I am a great admirer of Pope Francis. I respect his leadership. I find it authentic, faithful, powerful. I teach a seminar at Georgetown. Students are coming back to the church because of his leadership. I have also said publicly, and I say here, that he was too slow to understand and act on the moral and spiritual dimensions of this crisis. The lesson here is Pope Francis acted decisively after he listened to survivors and victims. That's what happened in Chile. I think that's what happens universally. And that's a lesson for the whole church. Survivors and victims have to be at the center of the discussion. And one of the achievements, I think, of the meeting in February, there were actually two in my mind. One was victims were heard and listened to, and women had a real voice in the discussion. The Holy Father, in the face of the Vigano attacks, said, I'm going to be silent. And I understand in a certain Jesuitical way, that makes sense, but that is not spiritually defensible or pastorally helpful. Silence doesn't help us. We need leadership that listens, responds, and acts decisively, openly, and quickly to bring about accountability. So I'm out there talking to journalists, talking at things like this, and saying silence is a part of the problem. And I had to acknowledge that I had been silent. I had my own secrets. At 14 years old, I went to a high school seminary in Minnesota, and I got a great education, good formation, made lots of friends, but I also was harassed and abused. This evil was a part of my life. I didn't tell anybody at the seminary. I didn't tell my parents. I never told my wife. Certainly didn't tell my kids. And so here I am lecturing other people about silence. And I decided I needed to do so. I sat down. This is 50 years after it happened, 45 years, and I could remember in the space of a couple hours who, what, when, where. And I sent this note to the provincial of the community, and all I asked for was an apology, which I got. And then I said, I'm going to not be silent anymore. So my lesson, I think it's number 8, is silence makes everything worse, and it's not an option for any of us. Sometimes it's not easy, and you will talk about that, but it can be healing, and it can offer solidarity. I went on the PBS NewsHour. I was not very comfortable talking about this, and after it was over, a cameraman came up and reached out his hand to me and said, thank you for doing that. That happened to me. Yeah. Number 9, and I'll move along quickly here. We are more than our failures. We need to get this right, not to get the right policies or practices or to fix our insurance or stay out of bankruptcy. We need to do this for mission. And we need to remind people that we're more than our failures, more than our worst mistakes. Tonight in this city, 1,000 people will find a place out of the wind. Today, thousands of young people, most of them black, most of them not Catholic, will get a great education. This weekend, tens of thousands of people will gather to worship their Lord and reflect on how they can be 10 better people for an hour. And in this university, young people are being formed as leaders and as faithful members of our community. And I would suggest that Catholic social teaching, what Jonathan and I work on, offers a way forward. Human life and dignity, solidarity and subsidiarity, rights and responsibility to both assess the crisis and to carve our path forward. Finally, lesson number 10, we're in this together. We should resist the temptation to use this crisis to score points, to advance our own agendas, to make excuses for our friends and our heroes, and attack our adversaries. A crisis this deep, this profound, should lead us to challenge our assumptions, not just repeat them. Should get us out of our ecclesial bunkers and smug factions where we talk only to people who agree with us on both right and left, and try and find some common ground, some shared experience that we work together to renew and reform our church. In these 50 years, I've been a student and a seminarian. I've been an advocate and a convener. I've been a staff member and a parishioner. I've been a professor and a lay leader. I guess I'm here today as a survivor. But mostly I'm here today as a believer. This is my spiritual home. The gospel gives my life meaning. Catholic social teaching is my work. And the home can be a mess, the family can be dysfunctional, but it's God's home and God's family, and we're a part of it. And I have found this Easter season more trying than most, frankly more passion than resurrection, given the crisis we're facing. But I took great comfort in the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and I think there's a Washington version of that, which is, have you heard what's been going on? The cardinal is not a priest anymore. The archbishop has resigned. The grand jury reported. And he said, Jesus is with us. And they saw him in the breaking of the bread. And it's not a matter of despair or demoralizing. If we recognize Jesus is with us, if we find unity in the breaking of the bread, then Jesus will be with us on our journey. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next presenter is Teresa Pitt Green. Teresa is the founder and director of Spirit Fire, which promotes Christ-centered restorative justice, healing, and reconciliation in relationships with adults, families, and parishes wounded by child abuse and trauma. The survivor leaders of Spirit Fire are cultivating inspired and renewed relationships for all those hurt by abuse and all members of the Catholic Church, rejecting cynicism and fostering ever-deepening faith and compassionate connections. Teresa is also a 30-year veteran of publishing entrepreneurship and is a certified mediator. She has been providing resources and programs to help integrate faith into recovery from abuse in the church for 15 years. She's a co-founder of the Healing Voices magazine, served for 10 years on her bishop's advisory board, and currently serves in a leadership role for the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force. Last November, Teresa was invited to address the plenary assembly of the USCCB in Baltimore. Teresa is a survivor of clerical sexual abuse.
Hello, good morning. After this really beautiful statement by my friend, sorry, I have a soft voice. Better? Okay. Could we just have just a moment of silence and wrap John, who's just shared something about himself, quietly as you may wish to pray, just for a moment to honor that this was more than a presentation. Thank you. My name is Teresa. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. What I'll do today is talk a little bit about my story in the context of what was happening in the church at the time, and also to tell you the kind of things that we're doing. But quite honestly, I won't have done my job if I just don't impart to you the joy of the Lord, and that I don't call myself a victim. I call myself a survivor. A lot of the survivors I work with call themselves thrivers because they've gone beyond this. And that the people who work within Spirit Fire they're out doing their little ministries in their state or in their parish, but they have us for support, and they share a common belief that it is with our faith that we make the final steps to a full recovery. But what I want to do quickly is give you two definitions before I tell you my story. And at the end of this, you'll have some ideas about what you may want to do. The first definition I want to share with you is, what is child abuse? A lot of people are talking about it right now. Thank you for bringing up how polarized it is. And I've been at this for a very long time, and a whole lot of people have wanted me to use me as a poster child for a whole lot of causes. Luckily, I'm a very feisty person and have had my fair share of arguments about this because I didn't suffer so somebody else can make a political point. In that context, though, it is important to look at institutional changes that need to happen. So even when I read everything Pope Benedict writes, because I love his writing so much, as from publishing that kind of writing is just gorgeous. And I saw somebody who was struggling to understand within the context of his life experience this evil. I bear no ill will to that. I don't think he's the only voice that's going to have an impact. I think he'll have a very important voice, and I think every voice should be heard. But I never kid myself that very many people get what it's like to have gone through what I did. And so that's what I'd like to explain is child sexual abuse can be talked about by therapists appropriately, sociologists, lawyers, God bless them, in law enforcement. Different laws in different states define it different ways, let alone in different countries. But here's what I know it is. And here's what I know every survivor I know would tell you what it is. It isn't sexual. So it is not sexual. When people want to tell me and start, one of the common things people respond to me is, homosexuality, chastity, those are really important issues. They must be addressed. I'm not questioning that. It's not an either or. Child sexual abuse is violence. And all of the experts can tell you one thing, but I know because I was there. It's dominance, it's violence by other means, and it's a murder of a personality that I'll never know that I had. And everything that comes out of that violent moment for the rest of my life has been coping with it. And by God's grace, and the unusual opportunities I have had with executive positions that afforded me great health care, that let me have great therapy, I've been able to work through hundreds, I think I counted almost 400 hours of therapy time. I'm 59. There's a lot of stuff I didn't do in my life, but at least I didn't take my life. So there's my success. And in terms of what that violence means on an institutional basis is critical to understand. It's not just violence. It's not just violence, it's the lies. I've never understood why, with all the experts that talk about this, the ones I trust who talk about abusers are the ones that get it's the lie. It's the high of the lie. It's the high of the deception. I could be in a room with tons of adults, and a predator could say something warm and loving to all of them, and I could quiver because I knew he was threatening me to not say anything. And I could see that was a high of power. So you can talk about all these other issues, and they're very important, and they doubtless play in, but if you can't talk about evil and understand that it recurs, so what you fix in this 100 years, evil will recur using something else, is a big deal. And I'm astounded the more I've talked to Catholic audiences, this kind of, no, it's this or that. No, listen, hey, let's get down to something really basic, because that's where I found my healing, by those truths. And I certainly used fantastic tools of therapy, of support groups. You know, sometimes 7 nights a week, I would go to support groups because I was in New York City and eventually here. And New York is Woody Allen's town, which is a name I have a hard time mentioning, but so everybody has a therapist, so there was no stigma. It's almost like, well, what did your therapist say? Do you realize, like, most of our country doesn't have that? And when I speak to international delegations, they don't even come close to what the rest of the country has. They don't even talk about abuse. And yet they're still talking about institutional change, but they can't wrap their minds around that and the fact that we have done fantastic work in the Catholic Church. Hear me, I was first abused about 6 years old by a series of priests, and the last time I was abused, I was 19, which was just before I left town, never went back. And one of those priests stalked me at my college. So don't, you know, I know what, I don't have, I can talk about all the stuff I know professionally, blah, 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 but this is what I know, and this is evil. And what do we bring back to it? I'll ask you to think about the burning at Notre Dame. And certainly there was a priest who ran back in there to get the treasure of the crown of thorns, the physical thing, the thing that touched the Lord. But what did he do in the fire? He raised the Eucharist and did benediction. And that's the thing I'll just ask people, okay, there's a lot of stuff you need to talk about, but that's the thing that you got to stick to. That's all I know. That's what got me back. There was no moral authority left in the church when I fled my town, and it sure didn't have authority after that, because just after I left were the first cases that were happening in the news. There was the case, I think it was Father Gauguin in Baton Rouge, and then there was some stuff off the West Coast, but then there was some stuff in Chicago. And if you're in the know, there were things, you know, bubbling up in Boston already. And I was in New York City in my career, heading up the corporate ladder, super smart. I was that smart, A, because I had gone to a fantastic Catholic school, which I really, if you want to do anything as a Catholic, work to make sure schools are funded and open more. Second, I also I was just smart, and I think that that's helped me. And I had a parent who The one time I got a D, because I always got A's, was because I wrote about Karl Marx in 7th grade to be precocious, and I got a D to teach me better about that. And my father went down and talked to the principal with me and said he sent me to Catholic school so that I would never fear reading or knowing anything because I would always have my faith. Now that's a crumb a kid who's being abused can really live off of for a lot of years. The other thing I would ask you to bear in mind is in your discussions broadly, whether you're in a parish or a pundit or in the grocery store, chances are a survivor of abuse is overhearing you. You know, we can talk about, our children, you know, I know that there's a lot of anger, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding how far the church has gone with safe child programs. Now, I think that they probably have to improve and evolve, but the children are safer, substantially safer than at the public school down the street. And let me tell you, I work in human trafficking. The predators now are in the hands of children in their bedrooms, in their living rooms, stuff, you know, I was safe from some of that stuff. And parents aren't even aware either. So there's a lot to do from a Catholic laity point of view, is to start to know and start to be able to talk about why is it safer for children. It clearly is not safe for seminarians, and I was horrified. But as somebody who's been doing this work with survivors for about 16 or more years, I know priests, they've confided. At this point, enough people know me. I have been in the grocery store where somebody's come up 2 minutes, told me their story, disappears. I'll never hear from them again, but we prayed for a moment. And they may never tell anybody else. But guess what? I'm not the only person people will turn to if they know Catholics get it. The thing I would also say is, you have to understand that something else I wish people would really understand and take to heart, because I think it would be an important way of valuing priests more, is that nobody knows how holy and important a priest is, like a survivor of clergy abuse, and I'll tell you why. And every room I go into, every priest I meet, I say this. That's because we know the exact opposite of what a priest is. You can talk about the impact of child sexual abuse on me when I was little, sociologically, physically, oh my goodness, I've had so many healthcare issues, it's preposterous. And I think my mind stayed stronger because I somatized, so I have all sorts of health issues that are, by medical study, can be tracked back to having been abused. But one of the things that people don't talk about is the loss of free will, the absolute destruction of free will. There's no free will in that, and you don't believe in free will when you come out of it. And if it's a priest, you really don't believe in it. And that's a big deal. And similarly, perverted by abuse, from my point of view, was what is our church about? What is our mission on earth but to help people find Jesus and his mercy? So you had a church forgiving all of these abusers. We were like let's just say any priest I ever knew in my hometown was some kind of abuser. I might not have been his particular interest, but they were lots of drinking, a couple drug addicts, and I am sure 2 were demonic. But the church knows how to forgive. It's the first thing it does to the wrong. And it's important to understand when psychologists back when were telling bishops that abusers could be saved, they believed it. It was a developing science. It was a young science. Now, yeah, I was really ticked about it for years. I'm old. I got so many years, I just can't be bothered with the anger anymore. But it was really useful to get through a whole lot of therapy, which I think, and I know authors, and anger can be creative too, and destructive. And what I'll say is, it's really important to understand that forgiveness became perverted by someone who was really, really into lying for the fun of it, for the high of it, for the control. And it was turned into enabling. Now, there's all sorts of people and all sorts of theories, and I've read them a lot because that's what I do. And it all goes back to this sense of enabling and unwitting enabling in a family system that was wounded. So while I'm not trying to argue for all sorts of forgiveness to people who are accountable, and I shudder to think, like I said in Baltimore, I just grieve for how much these people have hurt the Lord, and also what they'll face when they face the Lord. And I believe we must be active in making sure that there are boundaries around abusers and those who would be easy with them. But at the same time, I and other survivors that work with us believe abusers should be cared for. We believe when somebody gets removed, there should be not just hiding this person away, but acknowledgement. And in order to have good communications, there may be even friends that they may need to get through a really tough time. And some are really hardened, because I know I can choose which ones I know from my past wouldn't benefit, but I'm telling you some could. And I have one thing in front of me, and that's Jesus. I want boundaries around that person. I want nobody lying or kidding themselves about that person, but I'm not denying that person either. The other thing I would ask you to think about is, when I went to New York and all the cases started to hit the first round, Cardinal Bernardin meant the world to me. He couldn't say anything to the press that I wouldn't read, because he's the first priest I ever met that was acknowledging this. I mean, I stayed alive on some of that stuff, and those years were really dangerous years for me. Meanwhile, I was working at this corporate job and working myself to death too, because I just didn't want to sit and admit what had gone on. And the feelings bubbling up, and you're using it to move ahead, and you're achieving all sorts of stuff. And I don't know very many people who don't hit some point in their life where, boom, it all falls through. For me, it happened to be a brain tumor, which arguably can be tracked back to the kind of a heightened adrenaline that children have if they're young and we've been abused. We have a high adrenaline the rest of our life, and a number of other things. I was misdiagnosed 21 times with this brain tumor because they knew I was an abuse survivor. And you guys, it's just depression, all your symptoms. And you can but if you opened a textbook and you looked, I would look just like a person who had this disease. But they couldn't see. So if you want to do something and you're a layperson, you go back to Jesus, you go back to that Eucharist, you realize how this is where the whole world gets all of its sustenance. And then you go and you work in your organizations, your associations, and help develop better protocols for dealing with all survivors. Not just me. I've got my doctors. I've fired more doctors than I can tell you, because nobody's going to tell me it's because I'm a survivor. I learned from my brain tumor. But not a lot of survivors have that. And what's also really important to understand is, within the therapy community, I've had wonderful therapists, fantastic people, but they weren't Catholic, and they were ticked at the church. And there came times when their view, one person's view, someone I love, we've reconciled, we're in really good friendship, but at one point was diagnosing me with that very powerful diagnostic abacus that can be out there, as having a repetition complex, because I kept going back to church. And for her, I was just creeping in the back. I couldn't even get through the foyer, except during adoration. I could tiptoe in the back of the cellar and there weren't people. I knew the times people weren't there, and I could get back in the church there, and I didn't know why I was going, because I hated the church at the time. And I was looking at being an Episcopalian and everything else, and I just couldn't leave the Eucharist. And I am not alone. I work with lots and lots of survivors. My telephone number and emails out there. I hear from survivors who are across the country. They don't get support from their diocese sometimes, or they're too afraid to tell anybody. but they'll hear about us with the magazine or something or other, and we kind of bring them to a prayer service. We have virtual prayer services, but what's important is nothing works until they can somehow reconnect. I know survivors who can't step in a church, and I went through phases like that. I've written somewhere, someplace. I used to sit out in front of a church in Virginia with my dogs. One was at the time, one was specifically an attack dog, one was an alert dog, and my missile near the church, but not too close. Watch everybody go in, very jealous, and I'd pretend to be following. And okay, when would be the Eucharist? And I would tell the Mass is over because the second wave of people left. And that worked for me for a little while. When another thing happened, which was awful, because the fact is it's cyclical, and you manage. In my case, in a lot of the cases of us, you manage it every day. Most days I win against depression, and some days I don't. But what I know I don't do is I don't kill myself. That's a big deal for me. The thing I'll say too is we are wounded in relationship, and we are going to heal in relationship. So it's really important to know that there's not going to be healing in the church without survivors coming back to the family, or you're always going to be missing somebody. It's just the way it is. And I'll tell you, the survivors I know are just so awesome. I can't imagine why anybody wouldn't want them to. Because when you've gone to the darkness, we call ourselves wounded healers along the lines of what Henry Nouwen was talking about. When you go to the darkness, when you're sure you can't make it, and believe me, there's no reason I'm sitting here except for God. So I like talking about my story because this is all joy. And I know that you all are sort of dealing more with the anger and the shock and the betrayal. I dealt with that 50 years ago moving forward. So we're out of sync a little bit, and I'm just telling you, there's a whole lot of joy up ahead. And if we heal. Something else I've done through the past 16 years, a favorite thing I've done, has been I've done trauma-informed ministry programs for priests and other Catholics, because there are these amazing opportunities for Catholics to be talking about this. I mean, you don't know what to say, aside from something polarized like left or right, or if I hear Vatican II one more time, I'm just going to go crazy because I don't have an opinion about it, because the last I knew, it's still the Eucharist, and I'm cool. I keep it simple. But a lot of people have an opinion that way. It might be true, but I'm keeping it simple. And from a survivor's point of view, probably don't care. So it's great to talk about institutionally, but you're a priest too. And you can go out and heal. And you can be mindful of what you say on the telephone, in the grocery store, in the parish hall. I mean, I went to a lot of masses, I was very obedient, sat right next to my parents. I love them dearly. It's one of the reasons I didn't tell them. Wouldn't want them to know this terrible stuff about me, or they wouldn't love me. And there are kids in that, you better believe there are kids in that congregation that are abused in some way. So what you're saying, they're going to remember. So you can say things about dignity. You can say about, not just, victims aren't just pitiful, gosh darn it, you're really resilient. We're really creative. We are amazing, actually. And you put us together with God, and there's just something that the church desperately needs. I don't even know what it is, but I know it's big enough that I closed my business and started doing it full-time last year. And what I'll say about in terms of the trauma-informed ministry, this is a language to understand. One of the things to understand is that most survivors really want to talk to a priest. Now, they might be angry at a priest, angry at the bishop. I've been there, totally get it. There's a process. It's not linear, but it's kind of linear in a kind of a screw tape kind of way. And in our group, we'll just make sure we'll walk with them till they do. Or we'll find a really great priest who knows how to do this already. And if they're not there, we'll go in and help them do a training. But the point is think about, I'll give you 3 examples and then I'll tell you a little bit briefly about spirit fire. But think about the person who's very, very common to have a borderline personality disorder, a dissociative disorder that's very hard to manage, heroically hard to manage if you've been abused. It's not always the case, but it's not uncommon. So that person's spending all of their life, and some of my friends have this, they can be kind of difficult to be around sometimes, and they're valiant. Their big achievement is to remember medication every day, to remember their worth taking their medication every day, and then also to be celebrated for just trying to keep it together. It's not so pitiful. It's actually pretty heroic. And there's 2 of those things Catholics can do. You know, therapists can only go so far if there aren't people around every person who's healing to support their dignity and to believe in healing. Healing's not going to look, I was really ticked off. One of the angriest times of my life is about 6 months into therapy, and I realized this was never going to go away. I was really mad. Like, I'm even mad thinking about back then when I was mad. But there's a whole amazing world that you can create and you can help people create. But it's all about our words. So with this person who's always trying to put the pieces together every single day, every single minute, and they're thinking, oh, I'm the worst, I'm the dregs, I'm ugly, I'm full of shame because we're shame-based people, what can I tell you? It doesn't take much to remind them of the Trinity and how there are 3 persons and through love are together. Therapists will often ask different personalities to get to know each other, respect and even love each other. So guess what? God already thought it out. We just have to know to tell him. And these are the kind of things that priests are trained and really get into. And here's the last one I'll tell you. I never knew anything that wasn't a lie. Even parenthood, I had amazing parents. Troubled, of course. You know, we went through poverty sometimes. My father came back out of the Pacific Theater, never talked about it. I'm a publisher. I looked for writings. Nobody wrote about it. There's one book on the area where he fought. This kind of unstated horror. So they carried their own burdens. And what I'll say is, it's really critical to understand that they still seemed like a lie. So even when their love wasn't, it seemed like it because nothing was clear. The priests weren't clear. The principal, who was a priest, wasn't clear. The principal who came to our living room wasn't clear, so home wasn't safe. Education was something done while dodging away from somebody who was roaming the halls. It was a very feral, frightening place for my life. But I'll tell you something. There is one word that will never lie. It's capitalized and we know it. And I receive it in the Eucharist and so do you. And if you can start from there with a survivor, quite frankly, I think that's something more powerful than some of the arguments I hear. Because we came across somebody who was very close to the Prince of Lies, who was very happy to see the church humiliated. And the church, as usual, human situation, works together with that sometimes. But like the burning Notre Dame and the Eucharist in the fire that we know doesn't burn us because it's the fire of God. That's why we call ourselves Spirit Fire. And what we do is, regardless of whether somebody's sued or not sued, or there's a lawsuit or whatever, we work with some dioceses, we work with more now. We'll work consultatively with bishops, but mostly it's to help bring survivors home. And it's mostly to help families of survivors who suffer by one degree of separation home. And to remember that the wound is multifaceted. There aren't just pragmatic issues that a lawsuit will solve. People come out of lawsuits pretty rewounded. And there's something somebody could do. Lawyers in the room, talk to your profession. A whole lot of survivors think that's a bunch of baloney. We understand, we respect, we're grateful that the church was brought to accord, but we're not fooled that other survivors are getting used in that process in a whole new way. I'm not speaking for other people in Spirit Fire, I am speaking for myself and my founder. But when you look at all of that, it's go back to your professions. Go back and talk about all the ways all survivors can be treated more carefully, more and better, because there's a legacy out there that you can't even imagine yet, which is we've created a child protection program like nothing in the country. It's time to even kick that up a notch and share it. That's the Catholic legacy, making other places safe. And that can be applied to every single thing we're talking about. So, Spirit Fire, we help set up jobs empowerment programs, training, because people are cognitively damaged, mentoring, survivor peer-to-peer counseling with the caveat that people need to be in therapy. It's not a replacement. We help every priest we possibly can to understand how to talk to a survivor when they arrive, and that there's nothing wrong with a priest to start with. And we really try to do that with in diocese, bring people together so that they start realizing it's a family that's been wounded. And we're the most wounded kid coming back saying, hey, everybody, let's talk. So I thank you. My heart goes out to you because I remember the betrayals and the rages and I don't mean to be indifferent to it. I'm just like, I'm somewhere else. And it's been a long haul. And I got the Eucharist. I'm really impressed with the people I deal with. But even if I wasn't, I got the Eucharist back. And that's really a really important piece.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. I am aware that I'm now trying to moderate a question and answer session with someone who I think is one of the most naturally talented moderators I've ever seen, John Carr. So I won't try to be funny or anything like that. I have a very simple question for both of you. And maybe it has a simple answer, maybe it doesn't. How should people who are not survivors of abuse encounter people who are?
I go first.
Since I'm relatively new at this, my feelings are a little raw. Modesty. I mean, we don't have lots of answers. I've tried to describe my own experience. I'm more clear personally about the second part of the crisis than the first, in terms of the failures of or the inaction or the inability of our leaders to face up to this. What happened to me was not the worst that you've read about in the Pennsylvania grand jury or what you've been through, but I think listen, learn. Solidarity is a good thing. I was on the NewsHour with a woman who was in a very different position than me. She had left the church, was really ticked off, had lost trust. And I could tell from the very beginning when we met in the green room that she considered me not a fellow survivor really, but a representative of the institutional church. So we're in this, it's very tense. Judy Woodruff is, asking me to talk about things I don't want to talk about. She talked about her experience, that a priest had essentially moved into their family and took advantage of her. And in the middle of this interview, I leaned over and I said, I'm really sorry that happened to you and it wasn't right. And she said, thank you. And what struck me about that is when friends, you can tell which of your friends watch the news hour, they write you emails. Nobody remembered what I said. They remembered that I had simply said, I'm sorry that happened to you. So maybe that's a lesson. The other thing, frankly, is to join us in trying to make this better. The theories about which ecclesiology, which theology, which politics I find particularly unhelpful. My sense of this is while there are issues in all those things, and the left has their version, the center has their version, the right has their version, in the end, this was about power. This was an abuse of a power and a person and trust and faith. And however they got away with it doesn't change the fact that this was an abuse of power. And so don't use the experience of survivors to score your political points. Join us in trying to make things better. And every once in a while say, I'm sorry that happened to you.
Thank you. What I would say is I've been at this a long time, and I'm pretty known for doing this. So I'll give you some tips. First, just listen. Second, don't judge. Because often, with other stories people tell you, it's like, how does that work? And just listen. It could be somebody who's mentally ill, who's just still putting it together themselves. Just listen. And as you're listening, bring God into the moment. If only in your heart, that's very important. That's more important than a lot of people who listen to me think, but it's hugely important. And then after they've talked a little while, say, are you safe now? It's the most important thing to ask anybody on this topic. And if they're not, here's something laity can do. Know where to call to get this person help. Obviously, laity's not, you can't do it, but know how to help that person find that help. The other thing you can do is be very careful not to intellectualize it. This is something in the heart, or even deeper than the heart. I'm sorry, but I get a lot of people say, well, what about this? And again, like I say, what about Vatican II? That was before, now it's another bunch of issues. But it's like, well, what about it? I was still harmed. I mean, this doesn't, it's important for the institution, and maybe it's one of the causes, but that doesn't help the person standing before you that's a mess. So what's really important is just to say how that person is. Don't use the dog whistle of, okay, I'm going to show you how much I care by how much I'm mad about something. And for heaven's sake, don't get mad with them, because that's going to be threatening. And if you've got a couple extra seconds, find a way to tell this person about their dignity. If you know them well enough, you can say, wow, look what you've achieved. If you don't, say this, and it is true, this is not a lie. It's brave that you told me. And another thing you can say, which is also very true, is, are you aware that you're a survivor because you're standing? Because that's true too. So don't hesitate on these things. And it's also be aware that the best situation a person can be redelivered back to is either current or former really good therapy and really good spiritual counsel and a healthy family, which is not the case usually. Like 50% of the time, families are devastated by this. So what you want to do is just be aware that when they walk away from you, that they're going somewhere safe. If only for the next hour, it's work, fine, that's good. And the last thing I would say is, if you see them next time and they avoid you, that's okay. You don't have to follow up. Leave it to the person to come back. I told somebody and didn't go back for 2 years. And then I did, And they were wondering where I was, but I was like, I was thinking about them every day. They were so present to me, I couldn't go talk to them. So just bear in mind, there's a lot you can do in that moment of interaction. But one isn't to engage us on the institutional concerns that you have.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations. Thank you for being willing to share what you've been through, and I'm sorry it happened to both of you. I'd like to ask you, and I recognize this is one of those institutional questions, but that "are you safe now" question really struck me as something that I don't have confidence when I talk to my friends who are seminarians. Yeah. So how can we talk to the seminarians about whether or not they're safe?
Well, first you can talk to seminarians about whether they're safe, period. And if they don't feel safe, take them out for coffee and talk a little more. And over time, and pray together if somebody tells you they're not safe. And I know it tells you that you're investing, but it's a really great way to invest your time versus reading more stuff on the internet. In the sense that if you just know that person has you now. There are also places, we are aware of places that offer pre-seminarians retreats and support, so you could reach out to the different people who can maybe talk to him too. And most importantly, there is a way to bring this to the attention of the appropriate authorities, and it may be just too scary for that person to go in alone, but if he goes in with a couple of other people, it makes a difference. It will still be really scary. And if it's that scary, it means it's this really scary seminary. And that there are places in the USCCB that you can talk to. You can call me, I'll get you to those places. There are people on this campus, Monsignor Rossetti. What's important is don't let that person go back and be isolated again anymore. If there's something going on that's scary and possibly abusive, that's a place where it's really worth journeying with somebody. Not ready to go fight the fight. Journey with them, see if they're safe, see if they're okay, and then build up from there.
First of all, I find your question terrifying. If in this environment there are people in leadership in seminaries who think that they can take advantage of the people in their care, we're in a lot more trouble than I think we're in, and I think we're in a lot of trouble. My question is a larger one, and this is something I know very little about. I think we ought to look a lot at formation and selection and placement of clergy, and whether the current model, which is in varying degrees an isolation model, you spend most of your time with other seminarians. You're told constantly how special you are, and I think they are special. I thought at one point in my life I wanted to be a priest. It was I admire the priests I know more than I can say. But is the current way we go about this, where seminarians are so dependent on the leadership of a particular place for a long time, and their whole lives depend on what goes on in that little community? Shouldn't we be exploring ways to broaden the authority, the relationships, the accountability in seminaries so it's not up to one or two people whether you proceed or not? A long time ago, I used to get occasionally a questionnaire about bishops, and I think you're not supposed to talk about this. But it asked a number of questions, and they had to do with fidelity and all that. I assume now the questions involve their conduct in this area. But one of the things for priests, for bishops, for leaders of every kind, we ought to ask, is their capacity to work well with others, to in fact work effectively with lay people. especially to work with women. Women are the heart and soul of most of our ministries. So they can have all the liturgical norms, they can understand the teaching really well. One of the questions is, are they prepared to lead? And are they prepared to work well with others? And it may be that in assessing that, forming that, supporting that, we need different models than we have now.
Senior Rossetti.
Teresa, you mentioned something important, I think, about, you said there'd be really no long-term healing in the church without the survivors coming back. And I think that's an important idea. Could you talk more about that?
Thank you, Monsignor. It's very important for the survivors to come back because, for example, as we work with bishops in different dioceses and we go in, we're all survivors. And so survivors start feeling safer and they start coming in. Family members feel safer. And what happens is then the diocese can start healing as a family. Another point is there are things that the church says. I know a lot of priests and quite a lot of bishops, and gosh, their hearts are great. But there are things that they can no longer say with credibility that they can say with credibility and friendship with survivors. Big difference. And there are survivors ready for that friendship. And by being ready for that friendship, I mean some survivors are still healing. You know, it's not healthy yet. They have their cocoon as long as they want it. But also, where the church got wounded is where we were wounded, where the innocence of a child was destroyed by a priest, which I consider the holiness of the priesthood. But both were perverted, and both have been wounded. And so a lot of what Spirit Fire does is go back to talk to that wound in particular, mindful that when this wound occurred back when I was young, my family was wounded. My beautiful sisters have carried a terrible burden. They weren't abused, but they're deeply grieved by this. Our parish was wounded. Our community, our little town was wounded by this, whether they knew it or not, but they were later wounded. Their children weren't safe. So to bring survivors back to this wound, it's sort of our kind of restorative justice at Spirit Fire, where then we bring priests and bishops and Catholics and religious together with survivors in a dialogue that's something more than that. It's the beginning of understanding. Because what happens is this, I see it, the families start healing more, the priests, the bishops, the extended families, the parishes, because there's a ripple effect when you talk about this stuff. When you all leave these events, you're bringing healing out. And so what's really important is that we are also, of all the other things we are a family. And the titular head father bishop of a diocese failed the family. The betrayer did too, but the father covered it up. The father favored the whatever. So the family needs to come back and talk about this. But you know, the cool part is there's a huge amount of healing when that happens. And sometimes there's anger to start, but it tends to peter out when it's heard by the right person. It gets louder when nobody's listening. So essentially, Spirit Fire does collect survivors from around the country who are doing amazing things in little corners. And we work as a fellowship with family members and also with parishes and with priests, with anybody who wants to approach this as an incarnational experience where the word that is true, we speak that word to each other. And, you know, it breaks down on who's cynical about that and who's not, and that's a challenge to faith to every person. I know, I see it work, and I'm amazed.
First of all, Father, thank you for your work in this area. At our session on the law and lawyers and the sexual abuse crisis, we did not have a lot of panels. We had people around the table, and there was a survivor, there was a plaintiff's attorney, there was diocesan attorney, there was canon lawyer and all that. And they were all talking about how canon law and civil law doesn't jive and how it all works and all that. And what struck me was that the victims at my table and later said, you know, all this is a way to get things straight, but in the end, what we're looking for is some acknowledgement that this happened, that the institution owns that, an apology, and as I said, it's not your fault, and that you'll listen. I think Pope Francis is an example of this. My understanding, he meets regularly with survivors. He screwed up Chile massively, you know, because he trusted the information he was getting from the people who were deeply involved in the scandal, and somehow broke through and sat down and spent hours with victims. And it not only helped Francis change his view and act decisively, but it also changed them in the sense that if you listen to them after the meeting, they finally thought they had been heard. So the other thing, and this sounds cynical, but it's true, we need different leaders. I've made clear my admiration of Cardinal Wuerl. I thought his decision to resign was sadly appropriate. I am excited about Archbishop Gregory coming here. I was there in 2002 when he stood up and fought for accountability and responsibility and zero tolerance. I think he brings new leadership, which is what, in a new beginning, which is Cardinal Wuerl hoped his resignation would do. But my bet is he will listen to victims. At his press conference, he said, whether it's good or not, I'm going to tell the truth, and I'm not going to circle the wagons. We've tried, you know, sort of not being altogether clear about the truth and circling the wagons, and it hasn't worked. So maybe a more open approach that acknowledges how much trouble we're in, the mistakes we made, the failures, and then invites victims in, survivors in, to be a part of the solution. My sense, I admire what you're doing enormously. I have the people who came after me are past, but I have very little interest in meeting with them and telling them what they did to me. I have a lot of interest in hearing from the provincial how this happened and why it was so pervasive in the place I was in and what they're doing. And to be honest, I don't want this, you know, there is a push towards legal, civil, financial remedies, and I'm not going to dismiss that at all. My sense is there's a lot more to this than that has to do with spiritual, moral, personal, and that the combination of a defensive church and late arriving attorneys general is a particularly bad combination in terms of advancing the common good and caring for victims here. So that's my take.
Thank you so much. We're out of time. Please join me in thanking